That's okay.
Martitza Sifuentez-Chavarria is a candidate for district attorney in Brazos County. Joins us today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start out a little bit. Tell us about your background educationally and professionally.
Sure. So I'm born and raised here, and so is my husband. We have 3 children. I went to Bryan High, then Texas A&M, graduated '09, and then South Texas. So that law school's in Houston, but I lived here while that was happening. I would just wake up in the morning at 4 and drive back and forth. It was a lot easier to do that when gas prices weren't so high. Then I started my career here in the DA's office, and I worked there for the majority of my career. There was a small time period that I actually went to the county attorney's office here locally. So I had the opportunity to learn a lot about misdemeanor trials, DWIs, worked really well with law enforcement there. Then I was asked to come back up to the DA's office. I think there were some holes, some gaps that needed to be filled. And then eventually I moved over to the public defender's office, and I've been there since we opened.
The DA's office has experienced significant turnover in the past year. What steps can the DA take to stabilize the personnel?
So one of the things that that can be done is clearing up some inefficiencies that can easily be overlooked, and those have been overlooked. So that would be the first thing. When you clear up some of the inefficiencies, it allows people to, I think that boosts morale and allows them to be the best prosecutor that they can be.
So you mentioned inefficiencies. Do you want to be specific?
Sure. Well, one of the big things is that prosecutors have huge caseloads. And when I was there, we didn't have a lot of training on how to manage those caseloads. So prioritizing, there's tools that are at our disposal. Prioritizing them, you can do an inventory essentially of what your cases are, where there's bottlenecks, and what's jamming some of the cases up. So when you do those things, you can clear some of those inefficiencies.
What's your philosophy or attitude regarding how much discretion to give line prosecutors?
Well, I think that the discretion has to be there, but it has to come with parameters. My experience working in both offices, in the county attorney's office and in the DA's office. So what most people might not realize is that we're bifurcated, which means that in Harris County, for example, it's one large office that covers both. Here, it's 2 separate elected officials covering misdemeanors and felonies. When I was in the county attorney's office, one of the things that was really helpful was that we had parameters to go by. But within that, we have discretion. If you are able to communicate clear policies to your line prosecutors, then what that allows you to do is set parameters, but also use the discretion to move cases so that you don't get those bottlenecks that I was just talking about.
So what do you believe is the role of the elected district attorney? Manager, leader, trial attorney?
I think it's a combination. And my experience is that you have to have a DA that's present in the office that is willing to, or when needed, will get down there, roll up their sleeves, and get dirty, right? Just get in the trenches. But ultimately, you still have to have that person that can oversee cases, oversee the management, do the inventory that I was talking about, so that you can identify what's jamming some cases up and what can we do about that. So it has to be a combination. It can't be one or the other.
Death penalty cases, extremely difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. What is or would be your criteria for deciding when to seek the death penalty?
Well, I think that, first of all, the first thing that you have to identify is whether or not, what the strength of the guilt case is. If it's clear that guilt is not an issue, then that's one of the parameters that you should be using. If you ever have a question as to whether or not there's any type of weakness in the guilt, and here's what I mean by that. Sometimes prosecutors don't have proof beyond all doubt. That's not what the standards are. But if you are going to seek to take another human being's life, then the standard for which you're going to do that has to be a little bit higher than the way that we take other cases. And when you do that and it meets all the other elements, then capital murder is appropriate. And we've had cases like that in this county where capital murder is appropriate. We haven't always filed them that way, but when you seek that charge, it's important that you are using the same parameters consistently, and they shouldn't fluctuate between different types of cases. If you're going to do it, you got to do it every time, and if you're not, then you don't. But it leaves the community in a place where it's hard for them to understand or gauge what the justice system here locally is going to do for them.
On the other side of the spectrum, there's some who would say this office has not been aggressive in the case of white-collar crimes involving small businesses.
I would agree with that. My experience is that white-collar crimes aren't fun. They're difficult and they can be time-consuming. But 12 years ago, there was a promise made to the community that we would have a forensic accountant to help with that. And that was never done. And so that could be just having a forensic accountant, just like it was promised before, could be the thing that facilitates getting those cases to trial. And they are under-prosecuted. And it's really difficult. One of the last cases that I had, it was white collar, and what you realize is those are the very businesses that support all of us who live here. And they're victims too. Just because they're not the kind of victim that you're used to seeing does not mean that they're not a victim. It's just that they're a different kind. And the other issue with those white collar crimes is this. Sometimes they just take a long time to actually, for them to even make it to court, for them to be a plea. When that's happening, the person who's committed the offense, usually they're someone who's, I would consider to be a con artist. They've gotten your trust. They've stolen from you for a long time, and they've done it in a very sneaky way that's gone unnoticed. So when those cases don't go to trial and it's prolonged, what ends up happening is that those people go on to a different business where they victimize somebody else and somebody else and somebody else until they're stopped. And so prosecuting those, it's not just important for the initial victim, but it's important for everybody else thereafter.
Prosecutors are sworn to do justice, not seek convictions. What does that mean to you?
So the oath is actually to see that justice is done. That's the prosecutor's oath. And what that means is that you have to adhere to the rule of law, but you also have to do so with an understanding of doing it efficiently. And sometimes justice means to know when to toe the line and when to be flexible. So we're booming, right? Our community is growing. If we don't use both of those things, if we don't use flexibility plus the adherence to the rule of law when people are dangerous, there is no possible way that we're going to be able to move and grow with the community. It's just not possible.
Do combat veterans returning to civilian life who get caught up in the criminal justice system deserve special consideration in the light of their service?
Yes.
What role does rehabilitation play in prosecution?
Well, it's one part of a three-legged stool. Rehabilitation is where you start. When someone has come in and you're looking at their file, and especially when you see a cycle of drug use, or you see, like we've just talked about, veterans, that's where you start to make sure that what you're not doing is criminalizing conduct that really just needs help. And as a defense attorney now, I'm a public defender right now, but what I'm able to do in my current role is exactly what I wanted to do as a prosecutor. Identify people who need rehabilitation and use those resources that we have very limited resources. You have to take the resources that we have and make sure that if somebody needs rehabilitation, allow them to get rehabilitation, allow them to go get those services in the community, and then that starts to free up some of the clog, some of those other resources. And then you can take those resources and apply them to the cases that actually need them the most.
Sometimes the legislature passes legislation that's controversial. Are there any laws that you would feel uncomfortable prosecuting? For example, a recent case involving a woman seeking an abortion in Texas because her fetus was not viable, and carrying the pregnancy to term would threaten her health and future ability to bear children. The AG threatened to prosecute, although he does not have that authority, any hospital or physician who performed an abortion in that case. Short question. Are there some laws that you would not prosecute?
No, that's not my role. That is absolutely not my role. As a prosecutor, you have to abide and perform within the bounds of the law. And for anybody to do otherwise would be outside of what their oath is.
What kinds of criminal offenses would be your priority? Be they drugs, family violence, sexual assault, child abuse?
Child abuse. And those are the ones that I have that are my priority. And one of the issues that we have, those are the ones that are jammed up right now.
Do you believe the war on drugs has been effective? How would you handle low-level drug offenses? So
that's a two-part question, I feel. The first part is whether or not I think the war on drugs has been effective. It's weird because our community is changing and things change. So fentanyl is becoming a new thing. So as one drug, I feel, starts to go away, essentially, or you start to see less of it, another drug pops up. And sometimes it's more lethal. So I don't really know if I think that it's been effective. What I do know is that this community has a lot of them and a lot of it. And we have to deal with it in different ways, especially fentanyl. Fentanyl is a big deal. And those laws have changed, and we have new laws. If you're caught manufacturing or delivering fentanyl and somebody dies from that, that's a murder charge. And so I don't know if I feel like that's been effective considering the influx of new drugs. But how would I treat low-level drug offenders was the second part of the question, I think. Well, you have to take into account whether or not they have other history along with it and what other information you have. You can't just blanket say, well, this is how we're going to treat low-level drug offenders, because that's not the way that works. You have to open up the file, figure out what's going on with their background. Are they appropriate for pretrial diversion? Because that's where they should go. If they're appropriate, you need to let them use those resources, put them on that docket, and then carry on. There's so many different tools in the Code of Criminal Procedure that can be utilized to handle low-level offenders, especially when they don't have violent offenses attached.
There are 100,000 students in Brazos County. What is your approach to addressing offenses committed by students?
So when you mean, are you referring to college students, or are you referring to?
The 100, basically, but I mean, we have some high school students who might fall under that as well.
Well, and to be honest with you, what the studies show is that, especially Texas A&M, our younger students, their mind is still operating at the same level as an older high school student. And so when you're talking about students, just like when you're talking about any other group that has specialized needs, you have to look at what their maturity is, what they've done, and then you can assess a tailored approach for them. The other thing is this: if they're young or not, college student or not, if they commit a violent offense, everything else is out the door. You have to treat them the exact same way, and outside of that specific tailoring. But other than that, what's happening is A&M actually has recruiters that are outside Texas. They're living in the northern states, and they're actively recruiting people to come to our university. And so when you have those students that are coming to our university and they're not aware of our laws, or they have little understanding of what they are, it's our responsibility to make sure that they understand what's going on. And when they don't, you have to account for the fact that, well, these people might need a little bit more grace so that we can help them understand where they need to go. But that also does not mean that they get just let off because they're students. So if that's the question, no, I don't think students just need to be let off, but they do need to be dealt with accordingly.
Texas Attorney General is waging a battle to have independent prosecutorial authority to prosecute election fraud cases. Recently, the Court of Criminal Appeals handed down a decision ruling against the Attorney General having such an original prosecution jurisdiction. Attorney General of Texas does not have that. The Attorney General can appear before a grand jury in the state and request indictments, but the authority to prosecute still rests with the local elected prosecutor. Where do you stand on allowing the Attorney General to have the original prosecution authority in election fraud cases?
I think that needs to be something that is restricted to the local authorities, to the county attorney's office, or, well, their jurisdiction is with the county attorney, but regardless, it needs to be somebody that has actual ties to the community. The voters vote you in. You need to be the one that's able to be responsible for the offenses that happen here. And so that's what I think about them.
Okay. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to speak to?
No, well, I'll say this. People have asked me why I decided to run. And running was never in my plan. If it was, I would have shortened my name. It's a very long name, but I was asked to run. And I was asked to run by local law enforcement who see the DA's office, and they know that they're supposed to have an alignment with them, a collaboration. That doesn't mean that they're always agreeing with each other, but it is a critical relationship. And so when people ask me, well, why did you run? The fact is this: I've listened to law enforcement who asked me, victims who asked me, even nurses. And when you take the experiences that they've seen and that they've relayed to me, and I don't see any change in sight, and I know that this community is booming. We are going to double the population by 2060. Our county has almost more than 700 people in our Brazos County Jail. I know that we can't move forward unless there's changes that are happening. And I'm the one that's going to move us forward.
Do you have a website that people can go to?
Maritza for districtattorney.com.
Thanks for the time.
Thank you.